So in this segment, let's take a look at part 2 of the midterm exam for Labor Econ 3100. And we're going to look now at problems 3 and 4. So problem 3 begins with the setup. We have a labor supply and demand relation for BJSG ribs, and now it's in Thatcher, Idaho. So apparently not just Mankato, Minnesota, but now it's Thatcher, Idaho as well. We have the same labor-demand relationship we had in the earlier version of this. So it's labor demand 68 minus 2W, but now we have a labor supply of negative 10 plus 4W. I'm suggesting that this company is a profit-maximizing firm in a competitive market, and that the firm hires moderately skilled workers. That becomes important here. And these workers tend to understand that barbecued ribs and Dr. Pepper have a place at the top of the true food pyramid, which may not have a lot of import with respect to the answers to the exam, but believe me, if it has to do with barbecued ribs, it's important. So let's think about this. I ask you first to give me identify the market clearing wage and quantity for labor for this market. We're going to get that by equilibrating labor demand and labor supply. So 68 minus 2W being equal to negative 10 plus 4W. That's going to give us 78 equals 6W, or W star equals 13. The import of star, it tells me that this is a market clearing or equilibrium wage. If you don't give me the star, then I just know it's some W. So I've tried to reinforce to you that telling me not just the value, but communicating what those values represent is important. So I was looking here for W star. And if you didn't give me the stars, it might have cost you a small amount, maybe half a point on this. So we now have the W star. We know we can take that W star, plug it back into either of these equations, demand or supply, to get L star. So I've plugged it into the supply equation. Negative 10 plus 4 times 13, or 4W, is going to give me an L star 42. Okay. So in the second part, I say provide a properly labeled and appropriately articulated labor market model for this firm. So this is going to be for the labor market. And we need to find our intercepts. We've already found equilibrium, and recall that the best way to set up your graphic is to first find equilibrium, then find intercepts, and then you know the points for the creation of the graphic. You don't even have to worry about anything until you know equilibrium and intercepts. So we've gone ahead and done our intercepts. For the labor demand intercepts, I know that if labor demand is equal to 0, then 0 equals 62 minus 2W, or 2W equals 62. Excuse me, this was 68, not 62. And this is 34, just as I have for you here. So we then know that the W intercept for labor demand is going to be at 34. And we then know if W is equal to 0, the labor demand is 68, because labor demand equals 68 minus 2 times W, or 2 times 0, so labor demand simply equals 68. So we now have a value of 68 and 34. For labor supply, I know that when labor supply is equal to 0, then we have 0 equals negative 10 plus 4W, or 4W equals 10, or W equals 250. So we have a W intercept, so on the W axis, there's an intercept at 250. Now I can also think about the X-axis intercept, which you recognize is going to be out here in some other space. I could carry that labor supply curve out, and it would have intersected here at negative 10. I've given you when the W is equal to 0, so negative 10 plus 4 times 0 is still just negative 10. So we now have a point for the labor demand curve, both on the Y and the X-axis. We have a point for labor supply on the Y-axis. We have our intercept here for labor supply and labor demand. And that's all I really had asked you to give me, including the L star and the W star for this first part. Now you'll notice I have a few other things on here, but they're not part of what I asked for in the very first part. I asked you to give me more in another item here. So let's move to the other items. So I now say, okay, if another employer entered the market So remember, employers, when they enter a market, they demand labor. So another employer enters this market such that the wage increases to 15. So the additional demand has brought about an increase in the wage to 15. This might have some impact on BJSG's business operation. So how many workers would the firm choose to employ at that wage? Well, I know what BJSG's labor demand relationship is. It's 68 minus 2W. So 68 minus 2 now times 15, or the new wage in this market. Remember, there's an additional demand that brought the prices up. So that would suggest that BJSG is going to then, at that $15, employ 38 workers. Okay, so 38 workers. Well, assuming BJSG changes the number of workers to accommodate the change, so they went from their initial number of workers of, I believe it was 42, now to 38, how many employees will the other worker be able to hire? Well, or the other firm be able to hire? Well, we need to know then what's the full labor supply at 15. So labor supply at 15 is negative 10 plus 4 times the wage, which that's 15. So negative 10 plus 4 times 15 is 50. So the total supply is 50. Well, if we have the total supply of 50 and BJSG hires 38 of them, that leaves 12 for this new firm in the market. So the correct answer for that within it was 12 workers. I then simply ask you to, on the graph you've created in Part B, show this change this new firm would represent in this market. If you don't have all the information, then show me the dynamics, show me some generalized information. So I've said in here, see this in Part B, well, all you really knew then was that there was a new wage at 15, and so that comes out. You know there's a number of workers that are willing to supply their work then at 50. I know that because I took the 15, plugged it into the labor supply equation. It gives me this relationship. But nothing has changed about labor supply. We don't have new workers moving into the market. We're simply at a different point on the labor supply curve. We've had a movement along it rather than a shift of labor supply. But this additional employer in the market that motivates additional demand such that we have this higher wage and higher number of workers has caused a shift outward in the labor demand curve. So that we should see for this part, we should see a labor demand curve. Interestingly enough, most of you on the exam received this correct point on the labor supply curve, 15 and 50, but didn't properly show me some change in labor demand, which is exactly what I'm looking for here. Show the change this new firm would represent in this market. Well, the change it represents in the market is a labor demand increase. That's what motivated our improvement or our increase to a $15 wage. So now let's look at number 4. Number 4, I say the following labor supply and demand equations, again for BJSG Ribs in Thatcher, are the 68 minus 2W and labor supply of minus 10 plus 4W. Same things we've seen before. So if you answered number 3, you didn't bother with this. You answered number 4, you're doing this, of course. So we're going through the exact same structure here. This is the same information. Profit maximizing firm, competitive market, moderately skilled workers, barbecued ribs, and Dr. Pepper atop the true food pyramid. Well, the same labor demand, labor supply equaling the same W star of 13 and the same L star of 42. And I ask you to give me the labor supply and demand relationship. Give me the market model. It's the exact same model with the exact same intercepts. You're giving me the exact same information here, 34, 68, 2.5 for labor supply, and you're showing me the $13 in wage in W star and the 42 units of labor. This WM of 10 and LM of 38 come in another item on the next page. But your initial model was just giving me this information. Then I go ahead and say, all right, if the state of Idaho, so we're in Thatcher, Idaho, increased the minimum wage to $10 per hour, how many workers would BJSG choose to employ? Well, minimum wage, I don't recall that that's applied to moderately skilled workers. I think minimum wage is applied to low skilled workers. And BJSG hires moderately skilled workers. So this would be a moderately skilled worker labor market model for BJSG. In which case, we might have to think, well, where is 10 on this for a wage, and how many workers would supply their labor at 10? But these are moderately skilled workers, and the minimum wage is covering minimum wage workers or low skilled workers, in which case it's not going to affect BJSG at all because they're already paying above 10. Their workers aren't going to be willing to go backwards to 10, and they wouldn't want to take their workers to 10. Their $13 per hour workers are moderately skilled. So in fact, there is no short-term effect on this market model at all. No short-term effect at all. Well, you might have argued that there would be a long-term effect. And if you made that argument, and a couple of you did, that was kind of interesting to me. The long-term effect might be such that if minimum wage goes up, then over time, the wage for a moderately skilled worker likely is also to go up. We don't know if it'll go up at the exact same dollar value, a percentage change, what have you, but we might surmise that. And a few of you made that point, and I thought that was rather interesting. So in item D here, I've said on the graph in part B, show the labor market change result arising from this exogenous change. So as we look here, all I've done is shown where this wage would exist and where the number of workers exists. It gives me some point, which is a movement along this curve downward, but the curves don't change. The model doesn't change. Labor supply is in the same place. Labor demand's in the same place. We haven't had any additional demand. We just have a change in wage based upon an imposed wage, but that imposed wage is underneath the wage that we're dealing with, so it has no effect on this. So really, there's no other effect on this market model. And then finally, I say, what do the results you presented in Part D tell us about the market for workers the BJSG is hiring? And, with comparison to the market for workers receiving the minimum wage. Well, BJSG hires a more highly skilled worker, more highly productive worker than that which is covered by this wage policy change. And that's the answers to number 3 and number 4.